Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, J. Gregory Akin, author of Blue-Blooded Cavalryman.
Gregory Akin, author and editor of Blue-Blooded Cavalryman, Captain William Brooke Rawle in the Army of the Potomac. How did this gentleman come to your attention?
Many years ago, while I was still a student at a college here in Philadelphia, I learned of the existence of what was then called the Civil War Library and Museum in Philadelphia. So it doesn't exist anymore. It was on 1805 Pine Street. I actually saw a reference to it in there's a sort of a prolific Union author, if you will, or a Civil War historian named Bruce Catton. And I saw a reference to the War Library and Museum of Philadelphia on a picture credit in one of his books. So I had become very interested in the study of the war during college, and I decided one day to go to the Civil War Library and Museum. And I found it on where it existed then on 1805 Pine Street, became a volunteer there, and eventually ended up on the board of directors, which they kind of stylistically referred to as the Board of Governors, where I served for 12 years. So the Brooke Rawle letters actually, along with a couple of other collections that I published in the past, were part of the holdings of the Civil War Library and Museum.
You said it was there. What happened to it?
It suffered from kind of poor financing and poor management, if you will. So when I first became involved with it, the museum was working off an endowment that was established in the 1920s and really hadn't enriched itself in that time. So it was dependent on the kindness of donors, the kindness of strangers, people paying admission fees, walking in off the street. So to make a very long story short, and it has a nice ending, the three-dimensional artifacts from the Civil War Library and Museum, the swords, the uniforms, many things like that, are now at Gettysburg National Military Park, which is a great home for them, and they do a wonderful job preserving them. Many of the paper documents, including the Brooke Rawle letters and a number of other collections and historical records of former members of the museum, are now housed at the Abraham Lincoln Foundation of the Union League of Philadelphia. And I would add, just sort of a shameless plug, the book, my proceeds from the book are going to benefit the nonprofit Abraham Lincoln Foundation of the Union League. So it seemed right. You know, they own the book. They own the letters. It just seemed the right thing to do. So I didn't want to profit off of their collections. So my proceeds are being donated to them.
So when did you decide that William Brooke Rawle was worth a book?
Basically when I read his letters, which was many years ago. So I became exposed to the letters quite some time ago, probably.
Why did you start reading the letters in the first place?
Well, at the museum. So I became very familiar with the archival holdings of the museum, and this was a grouping of letters that was there.
So just curiosity is
very much,
I want to
very
read this.
much. Yeah, I want to read this. So there were, probably 15 or 20 different fairly complete letter collections in the holdings of the museum, of which that comprised one of them. And it was actually clear when I began to read them, he valued them very highly. He had them bound into a leather-bound volume. Nicely, he had some diaries. There were original diaries at one point in time, and the story is explained in the book. To make a long story short, they were in private hands and have since disappeared. No one has seen his diaries since probably the late 1980s, early 1990s. Brooke Rawle had some foresight, though, in that in about the 1880s, he had a typescript copy of his diaries made up, and that was also bound into a leather volume. So it really was kind of a nice, complete, recounting of his war experiences from the middle of 1863 when he got out of the University of Pennsylvania, all the way through the end of the war. Actually, he served after Appomattox through August 1865. So I had a nice collection of letters and the diaries. We'll talk more about how he became a fairly prolific historian of the Battle of Gettysburg and the cavalry fighting there. But it just seemed very appropriate. Part of it, you can come across letter collections that aren't very well written, and I've seen many, many of those, whether they're in other archival collections or colleges and universities and things like that. It was clear that these were the work of a very educated man, and he was very, very well written and well spoken. So that appealed to me greatly as well.
What kind of shape are the letters in? The paper?
The paper is in fantastic shape. So there was next to no acidity in paper at that time. So if these letters had been written anywhere from the 1890s to the 1930s or 40s, there could be some loss and some brittleness. And the only place I encountered some difficulty was there was some yellowing in some of the pages, and some of the, out of necessity, he wrote in pencil sometimes. So some of those were a little bit hard to decipher, but honestly, in a run of 150 letters, if there were 5 or 6 words that I couldn't make out, it was a lot.
What was the mail service like then? I mean, he was at the front in the Civil War, and he was able to drop a letter in the mail and
It's
going?
That's actually an excellent question. It was surprisingly efficient, especially, especially when you get into the Virginia campaigns of 1864 and 65. So Grant and Meade crossed the Rappahannock with the Army of the Potomac in early May, and there were really 6 weeks of probably the most brutal fighting that the continent of North America has seen during that time. They got outside of Petersburg, south of Richmond, after 6 weeks of protracted fighting and settled in there. The interesting thing to me was the letters that Brooke Rawle would send home from Petersburg, once they were kind of established in their system there, they were getting to Philadelphia within 2 or 3 days. And he was receiving letters from Philadelphia that were written 2 or 3 days prior. It was amazing. So when the Army was out actively campaigning, he mentions a couple times in his letters, "I've not heard from you guys in 3 weeks." And some of that happened around the Gettysburg campaign, but that was a direct result of the Army's mobility and the inability for the Postal Service really to keep up with the movements of the Army. But when they got into a static situation like Petersburg, I'm amazed that the rapidity with which the letters would go back and forth between the home front and the soldiers in the field.
You said that he left the University of Pennsylvania. He graduated at age 18,
He did.
Did you say?
He did. Graduated at 18. He was a very, came from a long line of Philadelphia lawyers, so he entered at 16, graduated just before not long before his 19th birthday. So he got his, he actually didn't get, his graduation ceremony took place while he was fighting on the field at Gettysburg. So he left before the graduation ceremony took place, but he did graduate.
Why did he join the Army?
I think he felt it simply, like many of the men in his social class, although there were plenty on the other side of the ledger as well, he felt it was the right thing for him to do. He's notably silent on a lot of his reasons behind why he should join the Army. I think he just was compelled by a sense of duty. He probably rightly saw it as the most momentous thing that was probably going to transpire in his lifetime, and in retrospect it was. But I think he saw it for what it was, and he felt like if he sat out, he would have regretted having done that.
And did I, again, read it right? Did he use family connections to get himself placed
So
in
partly,
the
yes,
Army?
partly. I mean, he could have enlisted without a problem at any time, but there was a wealthy Philadelphian part of the Biddle family, Clement Biddle Barclay, who similarly for a number of other prominent Philadelphians assisted them in getting commissions in regiments that were raised in Philadelphia. So Clement Biddle Barclay helped Brooke Rawle secure a commission in the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. So there were a couple of units that were populated with the upper levels of Philadelphia society. The 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry was one, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry was another, and some of the earlier raised units. So this was, I'm sure it was a place that Clement Biddle Barclay felt good about placing Brooke Rawle, because there were other, and I'm using my air quotes, gentlemen who populated the officer ranks of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, and given his upbringing, given his wealth, given his pedigree, he fit right in with that group of men.
Did he enter the Army as an officer?
He did. He was commissioned directly from civil life. So,
what did he know about being a soldier?
He probably next to nothing. I'm sure he did. He had actually tried unsuccessfully to raise a company on his own to join. He didn't specify what regiment it was, but he was not successful in that attempt. I have no doubt that in the months leading up, he knew in the latter part of 1862 that he was going to be getting a commission in the Army. So I have no doubt that he spent a lot of time reading books on tactics, reading books on movements, reading books on military protocols. That doesn't substitute for real experience, though. So I'm sure he took his book learning. He joined the Army. He actually joined the Army at a very good time. So they had just been, actually, unfortunately for the Army of the Potomac, severely handled at Chancellorsville. So not a good showing for Joseph Hooker and the Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville, but had not yet embarked on the Gettysburg campaign. So
and the 3rd Pennsylvania was at Chancellorsville?
So actually it's interesting, the cavalry was off on a raid. The cavalry was sent to raid in the Confederate rear and disrupt some other Confederate formations. So they were not actually at Chancellorsville itself or engaged at Chancellorsville, but they were actually out of the lines for about 27 days during the Chancellorsville campaign. So when he reached the Army, they were kind of resting and refitting, and it actually provided a very good opportunity for him at that time, and he writes about it, just to attend officers' school. The colonel of the regiment was a former regular Army officer, and really wanted to see to it that anybody new who was commissioned in his regiment would be able to command the men and perform the duties that were expected of them. So there was a lot of practical learning and book learning, and actually tactics and things like that took place during in the few short weeks right after he joined the Army.
That was in Washington, D.C.?
No, he actually went from Philadelphia to Washington, only spent a day or two in Washington, and then took a train down to the Army of the Potomac, which was it was in camp near Fredericksburg, actually, at this time, probably about 5 miles from Fredericksburg. They had set their winter camps up there. So after Chancellorsville, they basically returned to their winter camps, which were around Fredericksburg.
And you said he was commanding people twice his age.
He was.
So this 18-year-old kid comes in with no military experience and is commanding people who have been in battles before.
Exactly.
How'd that go?
For him, it actually went well. I know for a fact I've seen instances of it just in my studies where it did not go well for other officers. The Third Pennsylvania Cavalry was a little bit unique, and as we talked about earlier, they commissioned officers directly from civil life. Now they also commissioned officers from their enlisted ranks. And based on my research, about 30 people who were sergeants in the regiment were commissioned. They became second lieutenants and then moved on up from there. So it was a good transition for him. It actually went okay. I lost my train of thought there, but part of it is because because the regiment was so disciplined, because the regiment, for the first two commanding, actually the first three commanding officers of the regiment, 2 of them were former regular Army officers. What that meant was that discipline was paramount in that regiment. So unlike the volunteer regiments where you could have some unruliness, you could have some disrespect, the enlisted men in the 3rd Pennsylvania knew that if they stepped out of bounds, they would be punished for it, very much like the regular Army did. And the punishments were severe. I mean, these are physical punishments. They could be bucked and gagged. They could be meant to, walk with heavy loads on their backs for several days at a time with just a minimum of rest. So I think the fact that there were regular Army customs instilled within the 3rd Pennsylvania meant that when Brooke Rawle got there, he, by default, commanded the respect of the men. The men knew they couldn't step out of line.
One of the things, looking through this book, you have some group photos that this gentleman, William Brooke Rawle, is in, and the one thing that's distinctive about him is he's the one without the beard.
He is. It's a heavily bearded army. It's a great point, and there is mention by his mother. So when Brooke Rawle returned to Philadelphia in August 1865, his mother writes Brooke Rawle's grandmother that he's very sunburned and he has a beard, but that I think he will shave it off. Now he never makes any mention in his correspondence about having a beard, and I don't know. It could have been to combat his youthful experience. It could have been just for practicality. But you're correct. At least in the existing photographs of him, he is clean shaven, which was strange in that army at that time. Even among the enlisted ranks, beards and mustaches were the rage.
You also say his name was not originally William Brooke Rawle, but William Rawle Brooke.
Yes. So his father was a gentleman named Stephen Brooke. He unfortunately passed away when William was young. William became very close with his mother, who was left to raise him. Became very close with his uncle. Was
his mother's name Rawle?
She was. She was Rawle. So I mentioned, I think I mentioned maybe before we talked, he came from a long line of Philadelphia lawyers, and they were on both sides of his family. The Rawle law firm still exists in Philadelphia today. I believe it was founded in the late 1600s, or actually the early 1700s, or maybe the mid 1700s. But it's the oldest continual surviving law firm in the United States. So that was his background. So his mother's brother was William Rawle, one of actually a line of William Rawles. He was an attorney. He was part of the Rawle law firm. Brooke Rawle was very close with him as well. I think the influence of his mother, and they didn't make him do it. I think the influence of his mother and his uncle made him gravitate more towards the Rawle name than anything else. I think it probably helped when he entered the Rawle law firm after the war that his last name was Rawle as well. And it's how he, until just after the war, he referred to himself as Rawle Brooke. But from that point forward for the rest of his life, even in his published works that came out later, he refers to himself as William Brooke Rawle. He also does mention, actually a relative mentioned in a obituary written about him, that he changed the name to avoid, this is quotes, to avoid confusion in the family. So there's a couple of different theories on it, but I think it's probably because he gravitated more towards the Rawle side of the family.
So when he got in the Army, what was the appeal of the cavalry?
They were the I don't want to call them the pretty boys of the time. They were the shock troops. They were the elite forces of the time, if you will. So infantry was still king. It was what really most of the army was comprised of. But the gentlemen of the cavalry considered themselves apart from the infantry. They called them doughboys. Even then, they called them doughboys. And it would seem like a term that would come up in World War I. But they were, and I've come across infantrymen referring to themselves as doughboys during the Civil War. But it just had more appeal. You were riding, you weren't walking. A lot more glamorous. Early in the war, the cavalry kind of achieved just an aura about them of being elite troops. So I think that's what appealed to him about it.
How were the cavalry used?
Initially, not well. Actually, it's a two-pronged answer. The Confederacy used their cavalry quite well. So they understood how the cavalry could be used for shock value, how the cavalry could be used for offensive operations. George McClellan, who has his detractors and his people who think he's wonderful, he was a former cavalryman. But to distill the story, McClellan didn't really trust his volunteer cavalrymen.
I want to read something you wrote about that.
Yeah, sure.
McClellan, who was an exceptional administrator, organizer, and leader, was confounded when it came to the utilization of his cavalry. One of his generals wrote in September 1862 that the army commander knew precisely how to employ foot troops and cannoneers in battle, but that his mind went blank whenever horse soldiers entered the equation.
Exactly. Now, the interesting thing, too, about that quote is that letter was written by a gentleman named Alfred Pleasanton. Now, the interesting thing about the letter is it was written to Randolph Marcy, who was McClellan's father-in-law. So here you have a general telling McClellan's father-in-law that McClellan doesn't know anything about using cavalry. So again, I think a lot of it stemmed from distrust. Not so much there were there was a regular cavalry presence. There were, I think, 5 or 6 regular cavalry regiments that were assigned to the army. I believe McClellan entrusted them implicitly, but they weren't a large group. Most of the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac was volunteers. In McClellan's mind, and in some of the other officers of the regular army who served before the war, it took 2 or 3 years to develop and properly train and for a cavalryman to understand his duties. I think that mindset influenced McClellan to say, I can't trust these guys. So what McClellan did early in the war is he let them get parceled out as orderlies, as provost marshals, to just kind of the police of the army. And they weren't really used the same way that the Confederates used their cavalry.
So when they finally figured out how to use them, how much of what they did was fighting and how much was kind of surveillance, spying, and how much was picket duty?
Most of it was surveillance duty and picket duty, for sure. There weren't a tremendous number of opportunities, as there might have been for the infantry, for the cavalry to engage in battles. When they did engage, however, so McClellan left, Burnside came in, not a good fit. Hooker came in, and Hooker was the one who really revitalized the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. So he said, I think I've got some good assets here. I'm going to form the Cavalry Corps. So up to that point in the war, they had operated attached to infantry brigades and divisions, and it just was not an effective use of cavalry. Hooker set them up on their own, and from that point forward, they were used effectively in battle. Really, Hooker formed the Cavalry Corps in late February or March of 1862. They fought at Kelly's Ford, but the place they proved themselves was at Brandy Station in early June. So from a timing standpoint, again, Brooke Rawle joined the Army about 3 weeks before the Brandy Station battle. So he came into the cavalry at an excellent time for the Army of the Potomac.
Did he know about horses? Could he ride when he got there?
It's a great question. I don't know that. I assume he had just some passing familiarity with him. He was not a country boy by any stretch of the imagination, although the family, being wealthy, they had a country home out in Chester, Pennsylvania, so I'm sure he had some exposure to it there, but he lived in the city most of his life. So like many of the city boys who joined other volunteer cavalry regiments, I'm sure he had some learning to do, but if he did, he doesn't express it. He doesn't say anything about a learning curve associated with horsemanship.
Did he ever write about his horses? What kind of relationship he had with them?
He did. He writes, it's just passing references, but he had Satan, he had Carey, he had McClellan, he had a number of horses that it was clear he was fairly attached to. He had one called Pickaxe that went blind, and he had to go just let it go off the pasture. But one of his other troopers went and found Pickaxe and nursed Pickaxe back to health. So yeah, you could tell there's a cavalryman's attachment to his horses. As a matter of fact, when they were leaving Richmond, they occupied Richmond at the end of after the war. For a couple of months, they were in Richmond, and he sold off a couple of horses, but there were 2 he couldn't bear to let go, so he took them back to Philadelphia with him after the war.
Now, you were listed as the editor of this book.
Yes.
So what is involved in putting a book together other than transcribing and printing the the letters?
That's a great question. So this is actually the third book I've edited, so I've got a little bit of experience with the editing process. It's really about making the letters readable for the reader, if you will. So what I do is, for the most part, I'm reading through the letters, and I had, in this instance, I had the letters and the diary. So I didn't want to just throw it all in there together. There were things mentioned in the letters that weren't mentioned in the diaries, and vice versa. There was stuff that was repetitive. So part of the process was culling out what was unique to each of the sources, including all the unique pieces in the letters themselves. Really, my job from that point is adding chapter introductions, adding transitional material. So if he explains something or he's moved on to somewhere else and it's not clear to the reader, I add those. And then we talked a little bit briefly before the interview about footnotes and endnotes. So I spent a lot of my time, really, it's just explaining what is happening, who he's dealing with, the outcome of battles and things like that. And then, of course, an introduction. So that's really the editor's role, is to make the letters or whatever the editor is conveying more readable to the reader.
Did you have to go back and check to make sure the things he was writing were factually correct?
Very much so, very much so. So that was more so, and I know we're not here to talk about a prior book. The prior book was a memoir written well after the war. And that could be subject to a lot of hindsight and, oh, I was there for this and I was there for this. And I found some glaring instances in that memoir that were not true and had to call them out. In this instance, this is why I love dealing with letters, because I mentioned 3 books. The very first book was a book of letters also. They just have an immediacy. But the thing is, they can be very narrow in scope. So an example, the first book I wrote about was a Pennsylvania infantryman who fought in the wheat field at Gettysburg. All he could see was what went on 30 feet in front of him through powder smoke. He wrote very honestly about what he saw, but it was clear that what he saw wasn't necessarily accurate. And that's where I would come in and say, okay, well, this is what he thinks he saw here, but this is what actually happened. So the letters have an immediacy about them that I think is just, it's very fresh. It's a great perspective. And especially if it's someone like Brooke Rawle, who is educated and can write very well, it makes it that much better.
What did you learn about him as a person reading his letters?
Again, it's tough to... So prior subjects, they revealed a lot about themselves. Him, not so much. And I think it's probably a function of the blue-blooded side of him, the kind of the upper caste where, it's not great to show emotion. I mean, he writes letters. What was left in Philadelphia was his mother and his sisters. So he's writing letters back to them. These are not blood and guts letters. And I think that's partly because he didn't want his mother and his sisters to worry about him. I think it's partly because he didn't want to offend their sensibilities. But what I can say to your question, Brian, is he was very observant. He was opinionated, which is good. But he didn't let his opinions out very much. He let them out in his letters, but he didn't manifest them to other folks out there. So I think, probably he's best described as reserved, maybe even a little bit austere and aloof. But I think that's part of the regular Army bent of this regiment lends itself to that kind of behavior on his part.
You do write, like many of those in Meade's orbit, Rawle resented the plaudits that Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant received during the battles in 1864 to 65. You quote him as saying, "Meade does all the fighting here and Grant gets all the credit," he complained to his mother in a letter.
Yes.
Did he let on other opinions about the war, about Lincoln, about McClellan?
He did. Well, so McClellan was before him, so not very much about McClellan. A historian named John Hennessy has coined a term for people like Brooke Rawle. So he calls them conservative patriots. So they were, at that time, and again the meaning has changed over years, he was probably in spirit a Democrat. He was not necessarily sympathetic to abolition, if you will. So he expresses some very, they're difficult opinions to read in our day and age about African American people. It's just politically these conservative patriots as a whole, and I lump Brooke Rawle in as one of them. They like McClellan because McClellan was the anti-Lincoln, if you will. So McClellan ran against Lincoln on a peace at any cost platform in 1864. Most of these conservative patriots came to see that the election of Lincoln and upholding the principles of Lincoln was the quickest way to defeat the Confederacy. So I think that while sympathetic in spirit, and I write this in the book, to McClellan, he saw that a vote for Lincoln was the surest and quickest way to bring an end to the war. And I think a lot of people who held his point of view felt the same way. A lot of the soldiers in the Army felt the same way.
What was the first fighting he saw?
The first fighting was at the Battle of Brandy Station. So he joined the Army. He got there from Washington on May 16th, And on June 9th, they fought at the Battle of Brandy Station, which is actually one of the largest, and again, there's some debate about whether it is the largest, but one of the largest all-cavalry battles of the war. And it actually was the first battle in the East that the Union Army, or the Army of the Potomac, if you will, was really able to stand toe-to-toe with their adversaries in the Army of Northern Virginia and Jeb Stuart's cavalry. So he was actually involved away from the scene of the main fighting. The main fighting took place at a place called Fleetwood Hill, which is very near Brandy Station. Him and the force that the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry were attached to were sent kind of on an ancillary mission off on the flank. So, you know, he experienced some fighting, and he writes about it. He writes about the whiz of the cannonballs and the bullets, but his first really real combat that he experienced was at Gettysburg, which happened about 3 or 4 weeks after Brandy Station.
I read one thing you wrote about. He said, "I had a fatal accident in my company. Private Hartenstein fell dead at my feet. He had omitted to draw the cartridge from his carbine after returning this morning, and it went off, and the ball entered his mouth and went out the top of his head. He fell dead without a sound." Then a couple sentences later, and said, he said, "We amuse ourselves in the evening by singing and playing the flute and the banjo for accompaniment."
Is that amazing?
He kind of shifted gears pretty quickly.
He sure did, didn't he? And I would expect that. That was surprising to me as well. I would expect that from honestly, I would expect that from someone that had been in the Army for 2 years, because that would have been someone who would have been inured to the sight of, you know, dead comrades. The fact that he was able to, you know, kind of change gears in the midst of his letter after one of his company accidentally shot himself is fascinating to me as well.
You said that he didn't write home about some of the gruesome stuff that he saw. Did he put any of that in his diary?
He not so much. No, not so much. And again, it's a good call out. So you would think maybe he would confide some of that to his diary. I mean, you think about what he probably experienced and what he saw in the Overland campaign. So that was when Grant and Meade crossed the Potomac in early May of 1864. I mean, the carnage that took place between you know, the battles in the wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor. I mean, at Cold Harbor, you had 7,000 Union guys shot down in a matter of hours. And he just touches on it very lightly. So you know, not sure. You would think he would confide more to his diary about that, and he didn't. But again, in his letters, there was certainly some self-censorship applied.
Did he make friends with fellow officers?
He did.
And did he lose close friends?
He actually, yes, that's a great question. He did. He made very good friends with several of the officers, although he does note that he has spats with one or two of them every once in a while. But like anybody, they're like brothers almost. So brothers would have spats, and they would dissolve their mess, and one of them would move out of the tent, move in with someone else, and then they would make up later. I'm sorry, the other part of the question was, Brian?
Did he get along with his fellow
officers,
and did he lose any of them?
He did. That's a great question. I'm sorry. So when he joined the 3rd Pennsylvania, he was one of 3 officers that were commissioned at that time from civil life. The other 2, ironically, were both University of Pennsylvania students as well. So one of them, and I'm drawing a blank on his, George Ward, Elwood Davis is his name. He was also from a very wealthy, very patrician Philadelphia family. He accompanied Brooke Rawle to the 3rd Pennsylvania. He actually took sick at the Gettysburg campaign and came back to the regiment in the fall of 1863. Probably within 2 or 3 weeks of him coming back to the regiment, he was killed in some rearguard action associated with something called the Bristoe Station campaign. So yes, he did lose. He lost people in his company. Again, he doesn't really express very much regret over that. But he was shaken up by the death of his good friend Elwood Davis. Interestingly, you know, for a regiment that really. There were 8 cavalry regiments on the peninsula with McClellan in 1862, so the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry was one of them. Elwood Davis, who got killed in October 1863, was actually only the first officer that ever got killed in the 3rd Pennsylvania. So even though they were in the midst of some very heavy actions, they led a little bit of a charmed life. They did. You know, eventually, we'll talk about it later, they got assigned to the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac, so they weren't really in the thick of the fighting anymore. They became provost marshals and policemen, and they were charged with escorting prisoners and picking up stragglers. So that lent itself to the fact that they wouldn't experience heavy casualties.
When they were involved in fighting, like you said, Brandy Station was an all-cavalry.
Yes.
What What weapons did they use? What did they fight on horseback?
They fought on horseback. A lot of carbines. So
you do use a line in the book that it's when they lined up, it was almost medieval in appearance.
well, and that was yes, and that was a reference to the Confederates at Gettysburg when they kind of came out. There's a part of the field called it's the East Cavalry Field, which is preserved very nicely these days. But the cavalry was concealed in a wood on the north end of the the cavalry battlefield, and Jeb Stuart saw an opportunity to rush into the rear of the Union Army and create some havoc there. But he came out with, I want to say, between 3,000 and 3,500 men on horseback. The roar that just those horses trundling down that open field must have produced would have been amazing. But yeah, carbines, pistols, and sabers. A lot of there are a number of instances where at Gettysburg, members of the Third Pennsylvania were cut down by sabers. So the combat was very close.
Did he have much personal interaction with people like George Custer or any of his generals?
Not a lot. Not a lot, although he does. I mean, he mentions Winfield Scott Hancock, a Philadelphian in Pennsylvania. Actually, not Philadelphian. He was born and raised in Norristown, but he was the commander of the Second Corps. He mentions an interview with him. He mentions infrequently talking to members of Meade's staff, but of the higher ups, not very much interaction with the higher ups.
I want to ask you about something else, jumping around a little
Sure,
bit.
it's fine.
Late in the war, the 8 undersized companies of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry would be combined with 4 companies to form the battalion of the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and that caused a lot of problems. You say the only historian who ever ventured to write about the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, Edward Longacre, concluded that the unit achieved a record of failures, defeats, setbacks, and disasters probably unequaled by any other regiment, that the 5th had suffered the humiliating distinction of having lost its colors not once but twice.
The colors were very, very, very important symbols to these regiments, whether it was an infantry regiment or a cavalry regiment. I mean, that was their pride and joy. As a matter of fact, you see Union soldiers when they're able to capture Confederate colors on the field of battle, it's an occasion for an awarding of a Medal of Honor. So they were of immense symbolic importance. So yeah, getting back to what you said in the beginning, the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry was certainly a substandard outfit, and it probably stemmed from poor leadership. It stemmed from where the regiment was assigned during the war. It really was relegated to the backwater of the conflict. So to condense it, when the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry found themselves combined with the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry and really absorbed, if you will, by the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry after the war, it was not a happy marriage.
You said that Gettysburg was the thing for
Brooke Rawle.
For Brooke Rawle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was his in an obituary, and I mentioned in the book, a close relative defined it or described it as the defining experience of his life. So even though he'd only been in the Army for probably 7 or 8 weeks at that time, it stayed with him, and he even refers to it in later letters about different things about their experiences at Gettysburg. So he knew of the importance of Gettysburg as a whole to the war. He knew the importance of the cavalry field and the cavalry battle there. And he really made it a big part of his life's work after the war to study the cavalry battle there. So, I mentioned that his letters and his diary and some of his photographs are at the Abraham Lincoln Foundation of the Union League. There's a folder of correspondence, probably, I want to say maybe 200 or 300 different pieces of correspondence relating to his study of the Battle of Gettysburg, the cavalry battle at Gettysburg after the war. So he corresponded with, Union soldiers, Union officers he served with. He corresponded with many of the Confederates that were there on the field and really built a nice archive up, and it allowed him to publish, I want to say, 5 or 6 different studies about the cavalry battle at Gettysburg in the years after the war.
Where was he at Gettysburg?
So he was in the East Cavalry Field. A great question. So if you're looking at Gettysburg, it's out to the east. It's preserved very, very nicely. He was on a part of the cavalry field, sheltered in a woods. They call it Lott's Woods there. But his regiment was on the flank of. We talked about Jeb Stuart's column charging down the field earlier. Well, the 3rd Pennsylvanians had been ordered to hold the woods at any cost and not leave that location. When they saw 3,000 plus Confederate cavalrymen charging down the field right across their front, it was a little bit too much for them. So Brooke Rawle and his fellow officer conversed. The officer said to Brooke Rawle, "If I order a charge, will you support me?" Brooke Rawle said, "I will follow you till hell," in his own words. He said, "I'll follow you till hell freezes over." So they were able to help blunt the force of the Confederate charge by literally charging into the flank of the Confederate column as it passed along their front. And the officer who he supported ended up winning the Medal of Honor for his actions at Gettysburg that day.
How many people and how many horses were in the 3rd Pennsylvania?
Good question. Now, on paper, 1,200. Probably at Gettysburg, closer to 400 because of a lot of factors. Disease, death. Obviously, the horses break down. From the time they left Virginia on their march on the Gettysburg campaign, the regiment lost 72 horses. So horses were breaking down all over the place. Brooke Rawle walked his horse for much of the time in the 2 days preceding his entry to the environs of Gettysburg. He led his horse by the bridle, which probably is not a great thing to do on a 70, 80, 90 degree day in the summer. You're walking 11, 12, 13 miles. Now, infantrymen, some of them in the 6th Corps marched 25, 30 miles to get to the Gettysburg battlefield in the course of a single day. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for Brooke Rawle, but it probably was not an easy job to do that.
So what exactly was Brooke Rawle's job?
Really just overseeing his men. So
how many men?
So at Gettysburg, again, the regiment had been fairly severely depleted. I don't know the exact number, but I would venture to say probably between 30 and 40 men in his company. And he was put into a squadron that I mentioned, the captain that commanded the squadron, Captain Miller. So 2 companies generally formed a squadron. So in the squadron of men at Gettysburg, probably 80 or 90 guys, including the officers, were part of that squadron. But Brooke Rawle was commanding his company at Gettysburg as a second lieutenant who'd been there for 8 weeks and probably was in charge of 30 or 40.
What was the result of these cavalry battles?
Essentially a stalemate. If you will, the Gettysburg, but that was good for the Union because if they had not been able to blunt Stuart's thrust into what was essentially the rear of the Union Army, they could have gotten in among the supply trains. The Baltimore Pike was seen as the main line of retreat by Meade to get, in case something befell them, to get back. They would have been able to cut off Meade's line of retreat. It would have been a very interesting outcome had Jeb Stuart been able to penetrate the rear of the Union Army.
So when the battle was over, where did the 3rd Pennsylvania go?
They actually, there's a part of the battlefield you're probably familiar with called Little Round Top. So they went down kind of in the area in front of Little Round Top and just picketed there for about a day or two. But then they undertook the pursuit, as most of the cavalry did, undertook the pursuit of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. So the 6th Corps was one of the Union Corps that had been lightly engaged at Gettysburg. They kind of led the spearhead chasing after Lee, and the 3rd Pennsylvania went along with the 6th Corps through the passes of the Blue Ridge to try to chase down the Confederates.
When did you get interested in the Civil War?
That's a great question. I was a student at Villanova in the 80s and just started reading. I mentioned Bruce Catton. I started reading some books about Bruce Catton. So since the mid-'80s, outside of my professional responsibilities, a lot of what I've done has revolved around the study of the Civil War.
Why is it so interesting?
Just the human side of it. What these men went through, what they endured, kind of the courage that it probably took to stand up and to an enemy you could see, that both sides armed with rifled muskets that were capable of creating such devastation on a human, and what it took to compel these men to do this. I mean, these are young men, from 19 to 40, but average age I think is around 24 years old, who left their homes, they left their families, they left what they knew to sacrifice, and I think that's endlessly fascinating.
And Brooke Rawle had relatives on the other side.
He did. He had a cousin in a famous regiment. A famous unit of the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia. It was in the Stonewall Brigade, which is somewhat interesting because the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry got to Gettysburg on the evening of July 2nd. And one of the other regiments of the Cavalry Corps got into a little bit of a tangle with some Confederates who were trying to kind of come up on Culp's Hill. So anyway, the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry was sent to reinforce this regiment. And Brooke Rawle didn't know it, but he was facing the Stonewall Brigade at that time. So they were, Brooke Rawle probably wasn't actively trading shots, the men probably were, but there was a time there where he probably faced his cousin. The gentleman's name was Mordecai Lewis, who was a part of the 2nd Virginia Infantry of the Stonewall Brigade. And then he had an uncle who was in a Louisiana brigade. He became a quartermaster, and then another cousin who actually, ironically, attended the University of Pennsylvania with him, was from Mississippi. So when war broke out, he went back to Mississippi. Both got captured at Vicksburg. So he had some ties on the Confederate side.
He ended up in Warrenton, Virginia.
That was
for some time?
That's right. So the winter of 1863 to 1864, he spent in the environs of Warrenton, Virginia, which is still a beautiful town. But even then, it was one of the more established towns in that part of Virginia.
Did the fighting just stop then over the winter?
It pretty much did, except for, again, you talked to me. We talked earlier about the role of cavalry. I mean, they were constantly on the move. So they were picketing. They were looking for openings. They were. Mosby's guerrillas were very active, John Mosby. They were very active, especially around that Warrenton area, in either trying to just, randomly pick off Union pickets and vedettes. A vedette is a mounted picket, to gain intelligence about the Army, just to create havoc. And the cavalry were the ones that were assigned with keeping Mosby at bay. So it was a trying time for most of the cavalrymen of the Army of the Potomac in the winter of 1863 to 64, because they had to be, the infantry were mostly sedentary in their camps, but the cavalry had to be on guard.
And he said that the Warrenton area was pretty hot for secession.
He did. It was a very, you had a regiment of, or actually there was a company of cavalry, but several regiments of infantry that were raised around there. So yeah, there was very little Unionist feeling, if you will, in Warrenton. If you get into some of the other sections of what is now West Virginia and other parts of Virginia, you would have some Union sentiment, but towns like Winchester and Warrenton and Culpeper, again, they're the heart of the Confederacy, even though they weren't that far south, and they were, again, they supported their cause.
So they are in Warrenton. It's the winter. There's no fighting going on, yes. not major fighting going on, and they're going to be there for months. How did they spend the time? Bored.
So there were a number of leaves that were granted for soldiers to visit back home. Brooke Rawle took advantage of one of those. A lot of card playing, some gambling for the enlisted men. He was a little bit more upright than that. He was a bit of a teetotaler, so he didn't really drink very much, if at all. I haven't been able to determine that much. He liked pipe tobacco. He made friends with several of the residents of Warrenton, so he became very close with a reverend and his family there, and he would visit them, attended church in Warrenton. So again, a lot of just again, in a chapter of another book that I wrote, it was also regarding that time in Warrenton. I entitled it "Boredom and Idleness," because that's what a lot of that winter was for. When they weren't out on picket, they would usually do 3 days on and then 4 days off, and 3 days on and 4 days off. So the time on picket, however, he was. It comes through in his letters. He doesn't state it, but he was terrified. Especially in the fall of 1863 when they had just gotten there. He's still very new to the Army. You have, you have random cavalrymen who are out, just kind of surveying the countryside, getting either shot or wounded or taken prisoner every single day. And he writes at night it was a nerve-wracking experience because he never knew what to expect.
What would he have been like to be around?
Again, I think a little bit aloof. I believe a little bit, again, genteel. And again, I may be ascribing too much to his upbringing. I don't know that he would have been warm and opening and open, if you will. But I don't think he would have been unfriendly. But I think that part of it is just the way he was raised, and I think a little bit standoffish. A good example is I mentioned the regular Army customs that were in place in the Third Pennsylvania Cavalry. For Brooke Rawle to talk to an enlisted man without orders was unheard of. So unless that man had a reason to come talk to Brooke Rawle on official business, it was literally frowned upon for there to be any interaction whatsoever between the officers and the men, because it was modeled after the regular Army. That's how the relations existed in the regular Army. The enlisted men were not allowed to talk to officers unless it was on official business.
Can you talk about the distinction between the regular Army and the volunteers?
Sure. So the volunteers obviously were people from the cities and towns that enlisted for a finite period of time. So the regulars were part of the regular Army of the United States. Many of the regulars, although they enlisted, you could volunteer from civil life to go into the regular Army, and there was quite a bit of that went on during the Civil War. It's just that they were considered professional soldiers. They were so, and even though some of the enlistments were for a finite period of time, even if the war ended, they would have been expected to stay in the service. Where it was understood that if the war ended during the volunteers' term of enlistment, after a period of time, they would be allowed to go home.
And he was able to go home during the winter as a break?
He was. There were a couple of instances, I want to say 4 or 5 instances during his time in the service where he was able to get leave and go home. And actually, which was very interesting to me given kind of what a law and order guy he seems like. One of his leaves, he does write about it. He snuck away. He escorted some prisoners to Washington, went to a friend's house, cut the uniform buttons off his coat and had them replaced with civilian buttons, and then scooted home for 2 days. He called it was called at the time a French leave, but he even writes, he goes, I took a French leave. So I dashed home from Washington to see the family, No one missed me, and I went back.
Wasn't he also present for the hanging of some deserters?
Yes, although many in the Army were for a lot of that. So that was not an uncommon occurrence.
So what he did was not considered deserting?
It could have been. Now, what you find in a lot of these instances is that officers were given a lot of leeway, and it's not very egalitarian, if you will. So you're right. If an enlisted man had been caught doing the same thing, there could have been a very good chance that that enlisted man would be hanged. Likewise, officers were pretty much allowed to resign whenever they wanted to. So if someone kind of said, this isn't for me, or I'm a little bit too much afraid, or I had a lot too much to drink last night and I passed out and my commanding officer saw me, they were given the opportunity to resign. And whereas the enlisted men were usually punished fairly severely for the same infractions.
At one point, he got a promotion to lieutenant, first lieutenant, and he writes a letter saying, please take the enclosed first lieutenant shoulder straps to Lamberti's and have them made into a captain's.
Yes.
That is, have the additional bar on each end put on,
Right.
exactly like the other, which means that the wearer is a big cavalry captain.
Yes.
Please send them to me as soon as possible. It will save me $6 or $8.
Right.
So he had to send his uniform home to have the stripes
So
put on?
what he did, he took the straps off. So they were shoulder straps. He just took those off. He mailed them home. So the first lieutenant's bars would have been silver bars, one silver bar, and he just added another silver bar to each of the shoulder straps to denote that he was a captain, instead of buying new ones. Now, here's a man who, again, he was fairly wealthy. Actually, for the time, he was incredibly wealthy, and it wasn't maybe necessarily his money at the time; it was more of his family's money. So, but in an effort to save the $6 or $8, he sent the shoulder straps home and had them repaired. He did the same thing once with a part of his gun. He sent a part of his gun home to his mother and said, "Hey, can you get this fixed for me? It's not working for me, and I really need it." And she went and did it. But he had a lot of fun with that, with the piece with the gun, because it apparently would have been almost unheard of at that time for a woman to walk into a gunsmithing shop and say, "Hey, I need this piece for this pistol."
Well, he also was a collector of photographs,
He was.
you say, and he
was.
used to mail those home all the time. So
He did.
Again, the mail was pretty reliable.
It was pretty reliable. It really was. And he writes a lot about. It seems like in almost every second or third letter he's writing, enclosed is a photograph of so and so, enclosed is a photograph of so and so. All those photographs ended up. Long story short, when I first started my activities at the Civil War Library and Museum, his photographic albums, they're called CDVs, cartes de visite. His albums are part of the collection of that, and it still resides over at now at the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. But I don't know how it happened, but they kind of got plundered over time. So when I first saw the albums, probably in the early '90s to the late '80s, there were a lot of photographs missing from there. Kind of an interesting side note, though, he in the post-war years, he stamped the back of these carts with his name. It said William Brooke Rawle with his address on it. And on a whim once, I found one that was being sold by a collector. So the short story is, there's probably 20 or 30 or 40 William Brooke Rawle owned carte de visites out there with his ink stamp ownership on the back, but they've unfortunately disappeared from his collection.
Any of his photographs in your book?
Yes. Of his own. I thought you meant of him. No, just the one that I was able to buy. So it's actually it's in the first chapter. There's a gentleman named Edwin Heil, Heyel, and that carte de visite was owned by Brooke Rawle. I paid a small sum to get my hands on that myself, but yeah, that's included in the book.
So he ended up, after Warrenton, going to Petersburg.
He did. So the Overland Campaign first. So Warrenton, spent a lot of time near Warrenton. So during that time, the Third Pennsylvania was part of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac up until March of 1864, when it was decided that they were going to get assigned to Meade's headquarters. So they were taken really out of the active fighting, cavalry fighting, assigned to Meade's headquarters as part of the Provost Marshal Brigade. So their responsibilities changed in that they went from actually active cavalry fighting to policing, escorting prisoners back to Washington. During the wilderness, as a matter of fact, there's some accounts from other sources of members of the 3rd Pennsylvania kind of driving up stragglers, so guys who had fallen out of battle or were just kind of trying to hide. They went in and kind of shoved them back into battle. So they had a number of different, they guarded there was beef on the hoof for the Army of the Potomac. They guarded the beef herd for the Army of the Potomac. So their responsibilities and their functions were very, very different from what they had experienced up to that point in the war, from that point forward. So they were part of that campaign, but they weren't really in the thick of the action from March of 1864 forward.
So they were part of the siege at Petersburg?
They were, absolutely, yeah.
How long did that last?
So the Army of the Potomac arrived outside of Petersburg and settled in about the second week of June, and the siege was lifted on April 2nd, 1865, when Lee's lines just became untenable. His lines got stretched too thin. Grant knew it. He saw an advantage and took advantage of it and sprung some assaults on the Petersburg lines, which then caused Richmond to fall and a massive exodus out west for the forces from Richmond and Petersburg.
So that was another winter.
It was a winter at Petersburg, which, again, same kind of thing as at Warrenton. Passed fairly comfortably. There was some active campaigning during the winter, though, and it's kind of interesting. I mentioned that they were part of the Provost Marshal Brigade. They shed their responsibilities on a couple of instances and went into active fighting.
You say he describes the Battle of the Crater.
Yes.
In one of his letters, and does not say says some uncomplimentary things about the black soldiers.
And that's his racist overtones coming out, I think. And it's unfortunate, first of all. I also think it's misguided, because if you study the Battle of the Crater, what originally happened there is the African American troops were scheduled to lead the assault. And then Meade, about 3 days before, and they were specifically trained for it. 3 days before the assault, Meade was concerned that if they were slaughtered in the course of this, it would reflect badly on him and the Army and the Lincoln administration. He decided to replace white troops with the African Americans who were going to lead the charge. In the offing, what happened was, the crater was sprung. It was a massive pit was formed. A breach in the lines was formed as they desired. Leadership was horrible. Union leadership at the divisional and brigade level was lacking. And to make a long story short, really, instead of rushing around the edges of the crater, many of the troops rushed into the crater where they were shot down. And Brooke Rawle blamed many in the Army of the Potomac blamed the reverse on the African American troops. In hindsight, there were congressional hearings. There was a hearing in the Army. It was clear that it wasn't the fault of the black troops.
Where was Brooke Rawle when Lee surrendered?
He was at Meade's headquarters. I'm sorry. Yes, he was. Probably about 10 miles east of Appomattox Courthouse. So that's where Meade was at the time. Meade was sick for a lot of the pursuit of Lee. Grant was still mobile on horseback. Meade rode in an ambulance for a lot of the pursuit of Lee from Petersburg. And as part of Meade's headquarter guard, Brooke Rawle would have been with General Meade, the commander of the Army of the Potomac.
Did he write about the surrender, or what the reaction was when the war was over?
Just relief, and he didn't see any really the surrender ceremonies. But he does write. He does have some full letters. I kept the letters going up through May 15th. He really essentially writes about how the countryside was just covered with dejected rebels making their way home.
Did he know the war was over at that point?
He did. As a matter of fact, he went to find his relatives. So he went to try to find his uncle in the Louisiana Brigade. He rode into the midst of Lee's army with just an orderly with him. He says in hindsight, in retrospect, it probably wasn't the smartest thing to do because feelings were still raw. I think he did it on the 10th of April, so the day after Lee actually formally surrendered.
And they still had guns.
Absolutely.
How long did he stick around in the Virginia area after?
So in Virginia, probably until mid to late May, and then they were moved into Richmond as provost guard. So
just like occupation forces?
Exactly. So really, like he characterizes them as mounted street police, which he was not very happy with. Their rations were poor. It was exceedingly hot. He said their pay was irregular, so it was just, and again, that was where the combination with the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry took place, so it was altogether an unhappy time for most of the people of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry. But he only stayed there till August, when what was then the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry, again containing elements of the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry, was mustered out of the service in August of 1865.
Did he keep his diary going for the rest of his life, or did it stop right?
It's a great question, and I'd love to know if he kept a diary before. I haven't been able to find anything about that. So if it does exist, I haven't been able to find it. I'd love to see his diaries in the months and years leading up to the war as well, if one exists. But all that has survived has literally been from the day he got on the train in Philadelphia to go to Washington until he mustered out of the service here in Philadelphia in August of 65.
So August of 65, so it was 4 months or so after the end of the war.
Yes.
What did he do with the rest of his life?
He was unsure. He for a while he toyed with the idea of becoming a regular Army officer. So we wanted to be a regular cavalryman. Ironically, he was offered a commission in the 7th U.S. Cavalry, which was decimated at Little Bighorn. So not to say he would have still been with them then. It actually took a year for the commission to come through. By that time, I think he had decided to move on with his life. Again, he came from a long line of attorneys, so he became an attorney himself. He studied law under his uncle, who we mentioned earlier, became an attorney, and A fairly successful one. He wasn't a litigator. He did wills and trusts. And also he was very heavily involved with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania with his Gettysburg studies. So those were the main things in his life going forward. Married a woman with the last name of Pepper, who came from a line of Philadelphia physicians. If they had any children, or whether they died in childbirth or anything like that, there's no record of any children having been born to Brooke Rawle and his wife. And
he wrote a book?
He wrote several studies, not a book, but several pamphlet-length studies, if you will, about the Battle of Gettysburg. So in 1876, the Philadelphia Weekly Times started getting nostalgic about the war, and they commissioned people to write about various aspects of the war for inclusion in the newspaper. That was turned into a book. So his first account of the Battle of Gettysburg came in there, but then he wrote probably 4 or 5 subsequent studies of the cavalry fighting at Gettysburg throughout the rest of his life.
You say toward the end of the book, in December 1867, Major General Marcina Patrick wrote to General Ulysses Grant in support of a brevet promotion for Rawle.
Yes.
Meade endorsed, General George Meade endorsed Patrick's recommendation, stating that from personal knowledge, I take pleasure in concurring General Patrick's letter. So did Meade know who Rawle was?
He did, and part of it was, I'm sure that Rawle was at Meade's headquarters, although he doesn't record any conversations with Meade. Meade was very friendly with, Rawle was very friendly with Meade's son. So Meade's son was part of Meade's staff. Meade's son was part of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry originally, and the 3rd Pennsylvania Cavalry and the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, for a lot of reasons, were fairly close with each other. There were a lot of upper society gentlemen that populated the officer ranks of both of those organizations. So I'm sure part of why Meade wrote had to do with the fact that his son, I'm sure Meade had exposure to Brooke Rawle, but his son was also very close with Brooke Rawle.
Did you write that there's a flagpole at Gettysburg
There is.
dedicated to Brooke Rawle?
I saw it earlier this week. So
who was behind that?
So there was a Union officers veterans organization called the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, also known as MOLLUS. And they were the ones who established the original museum here in Philadelphia. They were responsible for, they recognized the work that Brooke Rawle had done in documenting the cavalry fighting at Gettysburg, so they raised the flagpole in his honor at Gettysburg. When he died, a plaque was affixed to it that says, dedicated to the memory of Brevet Lieutenant Colonel William Brooke Rawle.
So it was in recognition of his historical work afterwards as opposed to his work as a...
Yes. Although probably his presence there probably obviously played some part in it, but it was more for his historical work on the battle than anything else.
How do those pamphlets read?
They're actually good. He did a very good job with them. And he actually talks about it in some of his later writings. The official records of the war came out in the late 1880s to early 1890s. You know, Brooke Rawle did a lot of this back work on his own. He reconstructed the battle by his correspondence with former Confederate officers and former Union officers. Again, we talk about the fact that what Brooke Rawle saw at Gettysburg was, you know, he's in the woods, charge comes, he runs in and charges, and then he's off pursuing the Confederate army. He really reconstructed the battle very well. And he writes that, you know, after the official records came out, he went back and he reviewed the official records that the participants had wrote, and he kind of patted himself on the back. He said, you know, I did a pretty good job on this, considering that I was kind of flying blind here for a while.
Is there something you would ask him if you could talk to him?
Yeah, I'd want to know I'd actually want to know his perspective on his political thoughts during the war, and you could see he probably went in as a strong McClellan guy, and over time we talked about this. I think his views modified, and given some hindsight, whether it's 10 years or whether he and I were sitting here together like you and I are now, whether it's 100 years, what are your thoughts on how your views changed during the war? I'd love to get some insight into that. I'd love to know what he thought about slavery. I'd love to know what he thought about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'd love to know what he thought about, you know, larger notions like liberty and the Union. He's unfortunately silent on many of the broad themes of the war, and I do mention that in there, and I'd just love to pick his brain on some of those things.
You have another book in the works?
Not right now, no, but I do have some ideas, so kicking a few things around.
We've been speaking with Gregory Akin. He is the author and editor of this book, Blue-Blooded Cavalryman, Captain William Brooke Rawle in the Army of the Potomac. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.